Hello, and welcome to the Storm of Scripture. In the previous lesson in this deep dive series on Matthew 24, I adopted the view that Jesus' prophecy in verse 15 of an abomination of desolation that will desecrate the temple was fulfilled by the Zealots, who violently took over the holy place in the temple in AD 68 during the Great Jewish Revolt that ended in the destruction of the temple and indeed the whole city of Jerusalem in AD 70. Their murderous actions in holy spaces and the appointment of an illegitimate high priest were viewed even at the time as profane abominations in God's house. In an earlier lesson in this series, I said I had not yet made up my mind as to whether the Olivet Discourse addresses just AD 70, or a future second coming, or if it addresses both. By identifying the abomination of desolation the way I have, after saying that verses 4 through 14 are an outline of trials that will face Christians all the way to the second coming of Christ in the future, it should be clear that I am now siding with those who say it covers both. The lesson today will go from verse 16 through to verse 28, sizable chunk by comparison to how much each lesson has covered up to this point. And I will say some things that require viewing a couple of statements by Jesus as figurative language that conveys a meaning that is not necessarily what some would call the plain sense of the words Jesus used. Every interpretation of the Olivet Discourse has to take some stance that seems contrary to the most natural meaning of the text. A view that puts it all at AD 70 has to explain the wording that would most naturally point to a future second coming of Christ. Matthew 24, verse 30 is a prime example. A view that puts it all in the future has to explain the wording that would most naturally point to a fulfillment at AD 70. Matthew 24, verse 34 is the best example of this. And a view that says it addresses both must explain where the transitions are between one and the other. A tricky business with very little agreement among commentators who otherwise agree that Jesus has two fulfillments in view. Since I'm taking my stand that this is about both the past and the future, I'm prepared today to give you my outline of the Olivet Discourse as a whole. Now, I'm going to just mention verbally the sections in Matthew, the verse breakdowns there. If you are watching the YouTube video, you will see a slide that includes the breakdowns for all three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Also, the summaries I'm giving on this outline are based on content that crosses all three Gospels. Some of the Gospels give more detail at one point than another, and so the summary overview includes a little bit from all three. The Olivet Discourse begins, of course, in Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 through 3. The spur for the discourse is Jesus' comment about no stone being left on top of another, one thing that all scholars agree is about the destruction of the temple in AD 70. Then in verses 4 through 14, I believe Jesus gives a thumbnail summary of the future challenges for his disciples, all the way from shortly after his resurrection, which he calls the beginning of the birth pangs, all the way to his second coming, which he describes in Matthew as the end. Matthew 24, verses 15 through 23, then, is Jesus contrasting the enduring persecution that he just described, that call for perseverance and endurance. He contrasts that call with his instruction to his followers to abandon the temple, and indeed all of Judea, when it faces desolation. We're going to look at that in more detail today. And the next section as well, Matthew 24, verses 24 through 28, in which Jesus warns again of the trials and false teachers that will come after the destruction of the temple in AD 70 and will arise periodically all the way until his second coming. In verses 29 through 31, Jesus then explains that the very next thing to happen after this long period of trials is his second coming. Pointedly, it is not a rebuilt temple. I discussed way back when we were looking at the question posed by the disciples in Matthew 24, verse 3, that one of the concerns might be, when will the temple get rebuilt again if it's going to be destroyed again? And I believe the passage here in verses 29 through 31 that we will look again at next week is Jesus' answer that that is not going to happen. Instead, what's going to happen next, in terms of an eschatological plan, is his second coming. Nevertheless, Jesus moves on in Matthew 24, verses 32 through 44, to contrast an event that can be anticipated by watching for signs that lead up to it. I believe that is the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70, with an event further in the future that cannot be anticipated, but should be expected to happen at any time. I believe that's his second coming. Finally, in verses 45 through 51, Jesus exhorts his listeners to be ready for his expected but unpredictable time of return. In Matthew and Mark, that's a parable. In Luke, that's just a direct statement. Now, having given that overall outline of the discourse itself, I would like to tie some of the details that we've looked at before and will look at in more detail today to the timeline of the Jewish Revolt. I believe there are touch points between what Jesus teaches in the Olivet Discourse and the history of the Jewish Revolt, going all the way back to AD 66, and then touching again on a point beyond the Jewish Revolt proper to the next great revolt with Bar Kokhba, which happened in AD 135. But here are the 4 points in time that I believe are reflected in some of the teaching in the Olivet Discourse. In AD 66, for 1 week in November of that year, Cestius Gallus surrounded Jerusalem with a Roman army and had some success in that siege. For reasons that remain unexplained, he suddenly retreated, leading to a rout of the Roman forces by the Jewish rebels. Then in AD 68, the Zealots, in league with the group called the Idumeans, take over the Temple Mount. They desecrate the Holy of Holies and kill the proper high priest Ananus, along with anyone who had supported him, and they target Roman sympathizers. Anyone they suspect supports the Romans or is considering turning themselves over to the Romans, the Zealots just kill outright. Of course, in AD 70, that famous year, after a 7-month siege, Titus breaches the walls of Jerusalem and begins the systematic destruction of the city, including the temple. After the war, Jerusalem is essentially abandoned, except as an encampment for the Roman 10th Legion. The Romans are going to occupy the city of Jerusalem and indeed all of Judea heavily from this point forward. Much later, in AD 135, is the Bar Kokhba revolt. And after that revolt, Jerusalem's name is officially changed from Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. Judea becomes a Roman province with the name Syria-Palestine, and the Romans turn the entire province as much as possible into a thoroughly Roman environment. They try to eradicate, to the best of their ability, all Jewish continuity in the entire region, making it merely Roman. Now, I believe this maps on to several details from the Olivet Discourse. I believe that 1 week in November AD 66, when Cestius Gallus surrounds the city with his army, may be a reference there in Luke 21:20. Normally, there wouldn't be an opportunity to leave after the city is surrounded, but because Cestius Gallus retreated unexpectedly, there was a window of opportunity that came about after the armies had surrounded the city. Of course, Matthew 24 and Mark 13 describe not the army surrounding the city, but the abomination of desolation. I've already explained in some detail last week that I believe that is the Zealots when they desecrated the temple. And Mark's phrasing talks about or implies that the abomination of desolation is a person. I believe that could be the illegitimate high priest the Zealots appointed to that position. The 7-month siege and the complete destruction of the city is, I believe, reflected in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24:21. We're going to look at that today, Mark 13:19, Luke 21:22. And finally, in AD 135, in the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the complete crackdown of the Romans to try to turn Judea into Palestine and the Jewish heritage into simply Roman control. Sounds like Luke 21:24, where Jesus, in that account, talks about all of the Jews being dispersed amongst the nations and Jerusalem simply being trampled on by the Gentiles indefinitely. Having gone over the whole outline of the discourse and how I believe it intersects with the historical accounts of the Jewish revolts, a little bit with the Bar Kokhba revolt as well, I want to go into the text of Matthew 24 and the parallels. I'm going to back up to verse 15 just to get the beginning of the thought and follow through Matthew 24:15 through 20. We're going to break the sections that we're going to look at today into some smaller tidbits so that we can take them section by section. So Matthew 24:15 through 20. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, and let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house, and let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. The parallel in Mark is Mark 13, verses 14 through 18. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where he ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. Pray that it may not happen in winter. And then the parallel in Luke 21, verses 20 through 23, the first part of verse 23. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let those who are inside the city depart, and let not those who are out in the country enter it. For these are days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written. Alas for women who are pregnant, and for those who are nursing infants in those days. I believe there's one other parallel that I need to share with you, a parallel that is not in the canonical Gospels or even in the canon of the Protestant Church. However, it is in a book that is in the canon of the Catholic Church and certain other traditions. That is the book of 1 Maccabees. Anyone familiar with 1 Maccabees would immediately hear an echo not only of the abomination of desolation, but some of these other details about women with infants or pregnant in these days, and about fleeing to the mountains. Let's look at 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 54. And then there's a lot more exposition in Maccabees, so I'm going to skip down to verses 60 through 64. And on the 15th day of Chislev, on the 45th year, they, which is a reference to the people of Antiochus IV, they built an abomination of desolation on the altar, and in the cities around Judah they built altars. And the women who had circumcised their children, they were executed according to the command, and they hung the infants from their necks and their family, as well as the ones who circumcised them. And many in Israel were in suspense, and determined among themselves not to eat what was common, and they chose to die, so that they might not be defiled by the food and not profane the holy covenant, and they died. And there came a very great wrath upon Israel. Skipping to 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 27 through 28. And Mattathias shouted in the city with a great voice, saying, Everyone who is zealous for the law and supports the covenant, come out after me. And he and his sons fled into the mountains, and they abandoned everything they had in the city. Notice how closely Jesus' words parallel these events and the description of fleeing to the mountains and just abandoning everything without going back to get it. The echoes from Daniel and from 1 Maccabees are clear. But I proposed accepting the identification of the abomination of desolation as the desecration of the holy place in the temple by the Zealots. Now, the question arises, would a group of Jews really be considered as bad as Antiochus IV, even if they violated the sacred space of the holy place in the temple? Listen to the way Josephus describes how the Zealots treated the other Jews whom they felt were too soft on the Romans, or who supported the legitimate high priest Ananus. And while I read this, imagine how those Zealots would treat Christians who preached a message of love and brotherhood for all, including Roman soldiers. This is from the Jewish Wars, Book 4, the section from 310 to 313. The Zealots joined in the war whoop of the Idumeans, and the din from all quarters was rendered more terrific by the howling of the storm. The Idumeans spared none. Naturally of a most savage and murderous disposition, they had been buffeted by the storm and wreaked their rage on those who had shut them out. Suppliants and combatants were treated alike, and many, while reminding them of their kinship and imploring them to respect their common temple, were transfixed by their swords. No room for flight. No hope of escape remained. Crushed together upon each other, they were cut down, and the greater part, finding themselves forced back until further retreat was impossible, with their murderers closing upon them, in their helplessness, flung themselves headlong into the city, devoting themselves to a fate more piteous, in my opinion, than that from which they fled. The whole outer court of the temple was deluged with blood, and day dawned upon 8,500 dead. A little bit later in the same section, section 318 to 319, Josephus says this: I should not be wrong in saying that the capture of the city began with the death of Ananus, and that the overthrow of the walls and the downfall of the Jewish state dated from the day on which the Jews beheld their high priest, the captain of their salvation, butchered in the heart of Jerusalem. I believe the way Josephus describes this leaves no doubt that the Zealots would indeed have been considered as bad as Antiochus IV, even by their fellow Jews, because these Zealots and the Idumeans with them showed no mercy to their fellow man, their brothers in the Jewish faith. I want to turn to Luke's account in this section and look at some phrasing that he uses that caught my eye. Luke records Jesus saying about this time frame, "These are the days of vengeance, to fulfill all that is written." And he says, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles." I found that phrase, days of vengeance, to be quite unique, and since Luke was the only one to record it, I wanted to find out if this phrase might be an echo from something in a prophecy from the Old Testament. And indeed, I did find a reference. Days of vengeance occurs more than just once, but the passage in Hosea that I found seemed particularly appropriate to what's going on in the Olivet Discourse. I'd like to read to you Hosea chapter 9, verses 1 through 7, the first part of verse 7. Rejoice not, O Israel, exult not like the peoples, for you have played the whore, forsaking your God. You have loved a prostitute's wages on all threshing floors. Threshing floor and wine vat shall not feed them, and the new wine shall fail them. They shall not remain in the land of the Lord, but Ephraim shall return to Egypt, and they shall eat unclean food in Assyria. They shall not pour drink offerings of wine to the Lord, and their sacrifices shall not please him. It shall be like mourner's bread to them. All who eat of it shall be defiled, for their bread shall be for their hunger only. It shall not come to the house of the Lord. What will you do on the day of the appointed festival, and on the day of the feast of the Lord? For behold, they are going away from destruction. But Egypt shall gather them, Memphis shall bury them. Nettles shall possess their precious things of silver, thorns shall be in their tents. The days of punishment, and in the Septuagint, that's the phrase that's identical to what Jesus says, the days of vengeance have come. The days of recompense have come. Israel shall know it. Hosea's immediate audience appears to be the northern tribes, and he seems to be expecting the destruction of the northern tribes by Assyria and their complete eradication and dissemination amongst the nations of the people. When Jesus says that the days of vengeance have come to Jerusalem, he may be implying, I believe he is implying, that what happened to the northern tribes with Assyria is about to happen with the southern tribes in Jerusalem and with the Romans. Jesus says this would fulfill all that was written. And indeed, the destruction of Jerusalem, not just by Nebuchadnezzar, but one beyond that, is recorded in the prophets. Another place where we see something like this is in Zephaniah. Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the oppressing city. That oppressing city by context is Jerusalem. She listens to no voice. She accepts no correction. She does not trust in the Lord. She does not draw near to her God. Her officials within her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves that leave nothing till the morning. Her prophets are fickle, treacherous men. Her priests profane what is holy. They do violence to the law. The Lord within her is righteous. He does no injustice. Every morning he shows forth his justice. Each dawn he does not fail, but the unjust knows no shame. I have cut off nations. Their battlements are in ruins. I have laid waste their streets, so that no one walks in them. Their cities have been made desolate, without a man, without inhabitant. I said, surely you will fear me, you'll accept correction. Then your dwelling would not be cut off according to all that I have appointed against you. But all the more they were eager to make all their deeds corrupt. At the end of this passage, God, speaking rhetorically to the people of Jerusalem, says, surely you'll accept my correction. Surely you'll listen to what I have to say and repent. And when you do that, I won't destroy you the way I have the other cities. But, he says, all the more they were eager to make all their deeds corrupt. Jerusalem did not repent. The implication, I believe, the strong implication is that therefore Jerusalem will face the same kind of destruction that the other cities of the nations have faced. Babylon, Nineveh, Damascus. These are places that God has brought low, and he says here he will bring Jerusalem low because of their disobedience. And why? Because her priests are profane. They do violence to the law. This idea that God is going to bring wrath on his own city because of the unfaithful priests and leaders is something that is picked up on in multiple places. Ezekiel chapter 34, verses 8 through 10, echoes the same sentiment. As I live, declares the Lord God, surely because my sheep have become a prey, and my sheep have become food for all the wild beasts, since there was no shepherd, and because my shepherds have not searched for my sheep, but the shepherds have fed themselves, and have not fed my sheep. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against the shepherds, and I will require my sheep at their hand, and put a stop to their feeding the sheep. No longer shall the shepherds feed themselves. No longer shall the shepherds feed themselves. I will rescue my sheep from their mouths, that they may not be food for them. Luke's account of Jesus' teaching reflects a kind of parallel between what happened with the northern tribes under Assyria and what will happen with Judea under Rome. The people will be dispersed among all nations. leaving Jerusalem occupied only by Gentiles indefinitely. That is exactly what happened in the wake of the destruction of the city in AD 70. Now, so far, the text of the Olivet Discourse tracks well with the idea that Jesus was speaking of the desecration of the temple by the Zealots and shortly thereafter its complete destruction by the Romans. But the next few verses are why people push against this idea and believe that Jesus was speaking about something in the future, something on a much greater scope, something more like a Hiroshima atomic explosion, but on a global scale. That's because of the mention of a great tribulation. Let's read Matthew 24, verse 21. For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And Mark 13:19, the parallel. For in those days there will be such tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. Matthew and Mark both record Jesus as saying that the tribulation experienced after the abomination of desolation will be, quote, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. This phrasing may be an allusion to Daniel, specifically Daniel 12, verse 1, which says, At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as has never been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one whose name shall be found written in the book. Oh, there is a mention of a time of trouble there. Notice that both in Daniel and in Matthew and Mark, this is not the tribulation. The definite article does not appear. In Daniel, it is merely a time of trouble, though certainly a distinctive one, since it has not been since there was a nation till that time. But in Matthew and Mark, it is simply great tribulation. There will be great tribulation, not the great tribulation, just there will be great tribulation. I am not one that believes that Jesus is using this term, great tribulation, to describe a definite period of time, a well-defined and specific period of time. I believe he's using it to describe simply the degree of pain and suffering that will be experienced. It will be great. It will be a great tribulation that occurs. I would like to propose another possible parallel from Daniel 12:1. I have seen it cross-referenced as well in some of the commentaries, and that is Joel chapter 2, verses 1 through 3. Let me read that. Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. Like blackness there is spread upon the mountains a great and powerful people. Their like has never been before, nor will be again after them through the years of all generations. Fire devours before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but behind them a desolate wilderness, and nothing escapes them. I believe someone sitting in Jerusalem watching the Roman army approach might feel very much like what Joel describes in chapter 2. But if Joel's words about the army being uniquely large in all of history, and Jesus' words about the suffering being likewise unique, if these apply to AD 70, then they are exaggerations for rhetorical effect. They magnify the circumstances of the trial to underscore the theological ramifications of the trial. This is not in any way to suggest that the circumstances inside Jerusalem between AD 68 and AD 70 were not horrific. They were. If you want an idea of what was going on, just read Book 5, Chapter 10 of Josephus' writings, The Wars of the Jews. Josephus gives the summary of the contents of the chapter as, quote, how a great many of the people earnestly endeavored to desert to the Romans, as also what intolerable things those that stayed behind suffered by famine and the sad consequences thereof." End quote. Sad consequences is a gross understatement. Read the chapter if you want to know what living through a great tribulation would be like. Yet, on this side of history, on this side of mustard gas in World War I, of the Holocaust in World War II, the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and other atrocities, it is indisputable that there have been other times of suffering since AD 70 that compare to the experiences of the Jews in Jerusalem leading up to its destruction. I realize that not everyone will be convinced that Jesus' words about a great tribulation apply to AD 70. This is the point I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, that this figurative language does not mean what the plain sense of the words would be. If you disagree, I respect that. I welcome you to make the case for a more literal understanding of Jesus' words in a comment under the video if you wish, or in the Facebook discussion group, where you can have a more thorough dialogue with me. For those who do see some credence in my view, I'll move on to the next part, where Jesus says, "Those days were cut short for the sake of the elect." This is Matthew 24, verse 22. "And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." Mark 13:20 is the parallel there. "And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days." In keeping with my view of what Jesus is discussing here, I take those days as a reference to the time of Roman reprisals against the Jews for the revolt. This includes the destruction of the temple and the city of Jerusalem, of course, but the reprisals would be beyond that. They could have extended to an outright elimination of Jews, as had the Assyrian destruction of the northern tribes centuries earlier. The ESV rendering, "no human being would be saved," is more literally, "no flesh would be saved," which could be an intentional echo of the flood narrative, such as in Genesis 6:12, in which God speaks of destroying all flesh. Either way, it sounds like the potential end to all human life on earth. But that again seems to me like a figurative exaggeration. I take the all flesh to be the human life being threatened by the abomination of desolation mentioned back in Matthew 24:15 or Mark 13:14, and the armies mentioned in Luke 21:20. That is, the lives of the Jews. The Jews are, in fact, the elect in this verse. The same Greek word is used of Jews in the Septuagint several times, including Psalm 105, verse 5. It says this in verse 4 and 5 to get the context. "Remember me, O Yahweh, when you show favor to your people. Look after me when you deliver, that I may see the good done, your chosen ones," that's the same eklektos, your elect, "to be glad in the joy of your nation, to glory together with your inheritance." Your chosen, your elect. That is a reference to the Jews many times in the Septuagint. Jesus doesn't use the word the elect, or your elect, or my elect very often in the New Testament. In fact, of the handful of times he uses the phrase, he uses it 3 times in the Olivet Discourse, and only once or twice outside of that context, depending on which gospel you're reading. And he doesn't use it at all in the Gospel of John. So our uses of elect are quite few, and it's very difficult to pin down how Jesus might be meaning it, except in the immediate context. I believe the immediate context of his use in Matthew 24:22 and Mark 13:20 suggests that he's talking about the elect as the people of God, the Jews. And going on to the next section, Matthew 24, verses 23 through 28. "Then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you beforehand. So if they say to you, 'Look, he is in the wilderness,' do not go out. And if they say, 'Look, he's in the inner rooms,' do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather." Mark 13:21-23 is a parallel to this. "And then if anyone says to you, 'Look, here is the Christ,' or 'Look, there he is,' do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on your guard. I have told you all things beforehand." I believe a parallel to this section is Luke 21:24, particularly the last phrase. The verse is, "They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." Note that both Matthew and Mark open this section with "then" or "and then." This is a key word that I have already looked at in the prior lesson as indicating a sequence of events. So the use of "then" suggests to me that this is what happens next after the intense tribulation of the Jewish Revolt and the Roman reprisals. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus calls this the times of the Gentiles. This is a return to the same warnings that Jesus gives in his summary of the period between his first and second comings in Matthew 24:4-14, particularly in verses 5 and 11. So to revisit those verses, Matthew 24, verse 5 says, "For many will come in my name, saying, 'I am the Christ,' and they will lead many astray." And verse 11 says, "And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray." Now, I'm sure you picked up on the fact that Matthew 24:24 and the parallel in Mark mentions the elect again. Most interpreters want this to mean the same group of elect that Jesus just mentioned in verse 22. Tying together these two uses of the term elect is one reason people say the group in verse 22 cannot be the Jews that were under threat from the Romans. Those would not be the same people that the false prophets would be trying to lead astray, as most of the Jews under threat from the Romans were not believers in Jesus. But I don't believe Jesus is using the term elect in a particularly well-defined and restricted sense, and I don't believe he uses the word to mean the same group in both spots. In Matthew 24:24, I believe he's using it with another sense, a sense of someone or something that is above average. This sense is used of Rufus, a Christian, in Paul's list of greetings in Romans 16:13. In the Septuagint, it's used as an adjective of the 7 fat cows and the 7 healthy ears of grain in Pharaoh's dream in Genesis chapter 41. The healthy ones that contrast with the lean ones that represent the coming famine. Jesus is saying, when he uses the term here, that the great signs and wonders will be so convincing that even people who are highly perceptive and intelligent, one might call them elect, they might be sucked into following the false Christs and be led astray by their convincing signs. Matthew 24, verses 26 and 27 add to the basic warnings against false teachers and prophets that Jesus gave back in verses 5 and 11. Here, Jesus goes further to say that some will claim a secretive return of Christ, either away from public view in the wilderness or in secret rooms. But Jesus says his second coming will not be secretive. It will be like a flash of lightning that crosses the whole sky, lighting up the night in a brilliant display. Jesus' second coming will be unmistakable. The proverb in Matthew 24:28 concerning a corpse and the vultures is an odd one. Luke records Jesus saying it on a different occasion in Luke 17:37, a passage we'll be looking at in a future lesson in this series because of additional overlapping with the later wording in Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse. All the commentators are just guessing at the meaning of this proverb based on the mention of a corpse and the behavior of the vultures. D.A. Carson suggests that it means that, quote, "It will be as difficult for people not to see the coming of the Son of Man as for vultures not to see a decaying corpse," end quote. Well, that makes as much sense as any of the comments I read. If you have a different take on the corpse and vulture proverb, please share it. Your best guess will likely be as good as any the professional scholars have come up with, and I'd like to hear it. With that, I want to thank you for walking with me through this difficult center of the Olivet Discourse. This section is what some scholars would call the crux interpretum, the place where a difference in interpretation one way or another changes the complexion of the entire passage. Next time, we'll look at Jesus' comments about the sign of the Son of Man coming in the clouds. May the Lord be with you until we meet again to examine the treasures in the biblical text.